Hi, it's Tash. Welcome to Tash's Library. Today's video is going to be my November wrap-up. I'm going to discuss the books I read in November and what I thought of them. November was a really good reading month. I only read 8 books, which is a little bit less than what I normally read. However, I read some really big books. Now, 5 of those were fantasy, 1 science fiction, and 2 horror books. 2 were in ebook format and 6 were physical books. I'm going to cover these books in the order in which I read them, and then at the end I'll tell you what my favorite is. The first book I read in the month was Ilium by Dan Simmons, and this was for the prompt part of a duology, and this is indeed the first book in a duology. This is an epic science fiction novel told from the 3 points of view. So you follow Damon, Ada, Harmon, and Hannah, who all form one point of view, and they live on a future Earth which is inhabited by species brought back from extinction and largely serviced by robots. This does include dinosaurs, which is kind of cool. There's like a crazy scene in there. We also then follow Marmot, who's my favorite character, and Orphu, who are on an expedition from the Galilean moons to Mars. And then our third point of view is Thomas, who's a scholar traveling back to the Trojan War to fact check Homer's Iliad. Now, what's great about this book is that it doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't actually tell you what's happening straight up. You're just gradually piecing together, seeing how things might be interrelated, and it's the perfect amount of working out, because you're not confused, but you're intrigued, and it just gives you enough each time that you keep gradually working it out and coming back for more. It has some really hard science fiction infused with really good amounts of humor, a lot of literary references, including Proust and Shakespeare, which is just wacky. Like, this whole book shouldn't work, but it does. It has very surprising twists, an interesting rendition of the Greek gods, highly original and immersive read, really, that explores the role of technology, the importance of knowledge, courage, and identity. Now, note that it is dense in places, and there are some unnecessary references to intimate moments, which I think it could have benefited from leaving out. However, this was just like a superb book. I loved it so much. And if you love The Fall of Hyperion in particular and other epic science fiction, give it a go. I then read The Raven Scholar by Antonia Hodgson, and this also the prompts animal in the title. And in the Empire of Orin, you basically have 7 opponents from different houses, all inspired by the sacred animals of the realm. And these 7 competitors compete for the throne, because the idea of this particular empire is that the emperor can only rule for a certain number of years, and then the different houses have to compete to see who is going to be the next emperor. Now, when one of the competitors is murdered, however, mid-competition, the scholar Nima Kra from the Raven House is tasked with the investigation. This has really intriguing world building, very interesting, nuanced characters who are unlikable at times, yet really, really interesting to read about. Very engrossing mystery and twisty plot, even though the mystery kind of falls off as the book progresses. Tense and violent in parts. I truly feared for the characters. There was one night where I had to put the book down because I was so scared about what was going to happen. I'm like, I just can't deal with it tonight. There is a subtle romance subplot, but it's a tiny portion of the story and works quite well with the story. It explores themes of power, ambition, social structures, friendship, and political intrigue. Now, the initial chapters focus on back history, and so note that these read a little bit younger than the rest of the novel, and so you kind of start getting a feel that this is a bit YA, but it does actually progress from there. And the only other thing I really didn't like was there's a particular omniscient point of view character who occasionally makes an appearance, and I did not love that character. I didn't love what that added to the story. I can see why it was there, but I didn't enjoy it too much. But if you love fantasy murder mystery blends that is stronger than on the fantasy element of it, then go for this book. It is superbly written, and if you're doing bingo, this would fulfill normal mode for published in 2025. Then I finished A Language of Dragons by S.F. Williamson, and this was for the prompt, a book with a mythological creature. And this is set in an alternate Britain in the 1920s. And we follow 17-year-old Vivian Featherswallow, who becomes a code breaker at Bletchley Park after her parents are arrested for treason. So this is a young adult novel, but I really enjoyed it anyway. I don't really have issues with the age it's written for. To me, does it tell a good story? And this one did. I really loved the dragons and learning about their communication. And there's a pink dragon in particular I really, really liked. The sections on linguistics were fascinating. The world building was actually quite well done. And it's a very readable, fun book that explores themes of social inequality, authoritarianism, and redemption. It does look at Britain post sort of World War I. Now, for me, a problem with this book was Vivian is a little bit annoying. Very naive and quite stubborn, and she makes incredibly stupid decisions. However, I have to say that this is actually appropriate for the story, as she is really the vehicle through which the political and social reality of Britain is explored. Her privilege and beliefs are ingrained, and she rightly finds it difficult to let them go. And I think that's kind of the point. We're meant to be a bit frustrated with her because we see things that she doesn't yet see. And I think that works really, really well. And I thought that was actually quite clever. Now, the Bletchley Park setup is a little bit implausible as well. For example, the hiring of adolescents to work on vital war projects and then placing obstacles in the way of their success. That made no sense to me, regardless of how much you dislike them. The story is also quite predictable in places and certainly includes plot conveniences and plot holes. But I enjoyed this read. I will continue the series. I am looking forward to the second book, which I think comes out maybe on the 30th of December or just the very beginning of January, somewhere around there. But if you're looking for a young adult book with historical fantasy vibes, or you're doing bingo and want normal mode for Down of the System, or published in 2025 hard mode, then I would highly recommend this. I then picked up a book that wasn't on my TBR, and that's Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark. I'm gradually trying to read all of P. Djeli Clark's books because I have really enjoyed them. This is set in 1920s Georgia, and the screening of The Birth of a Nation unleashed a horror into the world, a true horror. And we follow Maurice, who has a magical sword, and her friend Sadie, who's a sharpshooter, and Cordelia, also known as Chef, who's an explosives expert. And they, with the help of their community, are monster hunters, killing the demonic Ku Kluxes. And the Ku Kluxes here are truly demonic. They're kind of like vampire-type creatures. So this is an historical supernatural horror that is truly creepy. Incorporates personifications of hatred, or African gods, body horror, eldritch creatures. It's very, very cool. The characters are interesting and well developed, despite the short length of the novella. I love the sense of community that was created as well, led by Nana Jean, her grandmother, and Nana Jean's Ring Shout, which is a spiritual and cultural practice involving religious expression and resistance against oppression. This is ultimately a wonderful book exploring themes of racism and also the power of community and family. However, the writing style didn't quite grip me as much as some of Clark's other books, and I found the idiomatic speech in it, particularly from one character, a little bit difficult to follow. Also, there is a lot of gore in this one. It is very violent. I didn't love that. But in the end, I really enjoyed this book. And if you're a lover of supernatural horror with an historical setting, then I'd recommend it. Also, if you're doing our fantasy bingo, it would fulfill hard mode for author of color. I then finished Never Whistle at Night, which is a short story anthology. This was for the prompt, plants on the cover, and it also fulfilled the buzzword from title prompt. Now, this includes 26 stories written by US and Canadian Indigenous authors. And look, I was a little bit disappointed with this. I'll cover what I enjoyed first. So I really enjoyed the themes of colonization, culture loss, identity, belonging, community, cultural knowledge, the human capacity for evil. Those were superbly treated by the different authors, and there's a very strong focus on storytelling and myth. However, I found many of the stories just too disturbing for me. And of course, that's on me. I don't like disturbing body horror type stories. And a lot of these were violent and filled with body horror. There was also too much focus on the darkness of humanity rather than the paranormal horror based on Indigenous mythology, which I was sort of expecting from this book. I don't really enjoy reading about the dark places that people can go. I'd much rather read about wacky mythological monsters. Now, there were 7 stories in particular I really enjoyed, and that gives you an indication. So they're the ones that stood out of 26. So one of them was Kushtuka by Matilda Zeller, and this follows a young girl at a white man's party. This is gory, but I really enjoyed the aspects of it and what it was communicating. There's also Hunger by Phoenix Boudreau, and this involves a sort of demonic possession, and this gave real Buffy vibes for me, and this was probably my favorite story in the anthology. Before I Go by Norris Black is super creepy. We follow a young woman who's visiting the site of her fiance's death and kind of gets more than what she bargained for. Night in the Chrysalis by Tiffany Morris is a haunted house story, and this was great. Behind Colin's Eyes by Shane Hawke was a creepy forest story. Night Moves by Andrea L. Rogers was supernatural horror in the woods of Germany, actually, which I thought was quite interesting, but it does still have Indigenous characters. And Darcy Little Badger's story, the scientist horror story, was pretty cool because it explored reality as horror, and I really liked where that went. So yeah, if you're a lover of horror short stories with Indigenous perspectives, definitely give this a go, particularly if you're okay with the darkness of humanity in your stories and you're okay with body horror. Also, if you're doing fantasy bingo, this would fulfill hard mode for 5 short stories. Then I read The Strength of the Few by James Islington, and this was for the prompt a random tarot card. This is the epic sequel to The Will of the Many, which I read last year and I really, really enjoyed. Now, I won't tell you what The Strength of the Few was about, but the first book follows Viz, who lives in a Roman Republic-inspired world in which society is ranked according to will. So those above, like in a sort of pyramid scheme, can draw on the will of those below, and this gives them physical and political power. Now, I probably like this second book slightly better than the first book, but really they're on par. They are just both superb novels. There are such devastating twists in this one, very, very strong emotional impact. The world is masterfully constructed, and the different areas have real distinct vibes. There's a lot of politicking, there are terrifying villains, very, very high stakes. So I found this ultimately so engaging, unputdownable, and the writing style was just so immersive. I just read this a lot quicker than you'd think for a 700-page book. It explores themes of grief and responsibility, class inequality, ruthlessness, power, ambition, and loyalty. There was nothing I disliked about this book, but note that it is quite violent in places. So I have heard it's going to be made into a movie. I wouldn't be able to watch the movie because I couldn't watch some of those scenes in visual form, but I am a bit of a wimp when it comes to violence. So if you're a lover of epic fantasy, you really should check out this series. You might like it. In fact, you're very likely to like it. And if you're doing our fantasy bingo, this would fulfill normal mode for published in 2025 and also normal mode for down with the system. And for my final TBR prompt, random picture generator, I read Atalanta by Jennifer Saint. This also fulfilled the Buzzwordathon cover prompt. Now, Atalanta is abandoned as an infant by her father for being female, and she's initially raised by a mother bear and then comes under the protection of Artemis. She lives then amongst the nymphs in the forests, and she becomes an accomplished huntress and archer. Then Artemis tasks her with joining Jason's quest on the Argo to obtain the Golden Fleece. So this is a retelling of Jason and the Argonauts. This is told in a very sort of lyrical fairy tale narrative style, which was interesting. It's very much first person, not a lot of dialogue, very, very descriptive, gives you a sense of someone actually telling you a story. And it explores themes of female power, gender discrimination, the nature of glory, the fragile whims of humanity, freedom, the capriciousness of the gods, and fate. All the themes you'd expect from Greek myths. Now, I didn't love this book. I felt that the narrative style actually kept the characters at arm's length. There was also no real sense of peril or adventure, which I found surprising because it's a quest story, and even though it's meant to be quite an adventurous story where they come across lots of perils, at no point did I feel excited, intrigued, worried for the characters. I felt nothing. There was absolutely no emotion in reading this story for me. Heracles was the most interesting character in the story, and then you also have some name dropping of various Greek mythological characters and other myths such as Circe, etc. But ultimately I found this a little boring. It came nowhere close to the quality of books like Circe. Now, I'm not a character-focused reader, so maybe that's part of it. So if you are a character-focused reader who loves Greek myths and feminist retellings, then give this one a go. The final book I read in November was A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping by Sangu Mandana. This was not for a prompt, but I just picked it up because I had a little bit of time at the end. Now we follow Sarah, who's the most powerful witch in Britain, but she loses most of her magic when she casts a frowned upon spell. She then settles down to run her Lancashire inn alongside her aunt Jasmine, and she brings small magic to the lives of those who stumble across the inn. But can she get her magic back? Now, this is not a direct sequel at all to Sangu Mandana's first book, so you can read them in any order. This had a fabulous mix of lovable characters. I loved Clemmy the Fox, who has a little bit of a secret. Luke, who's a taciturn historian. Matilda, an eccentric gardener. I really enjoyed those. There's also good representation of autism in a young girl in this one. It's a very sweet story with a subtle and slow burn romance. I don't love romance in books, and I enjoyed this one. And it explores themes of prejudice, family, found family, tolerance of individual differences. I didn't love the ending. It wasn't where I was hoping it would go, but I can see why it works, and it's growing on me. If you're a lover of cozy fantasy with magic and witches and a touch of romance, give this one a go. And if you're doing bingo, it would fulfill hard mode or normal mode for cozy SFF, depending on whether you'd read another Sangu Mandana book. But that's it. That was my November reading. It was quite a mix of books, and my three favorites were The Raven Scholar, The Strength of the Few, and Ilium. And I'm pretty torn between Ilium and Strength of the Few as my favorite book of the month, and I keep sort of flitting between them and changing my mind. So I'm just going to say it's a tie at the moment between Ilium and Strength of the Few. Both brilliant books that really captured my attention. What was your favorite book of November? Please let me know, and until I see you next time, take care.